Okay, hi guys. It's 8:02, so we'll begin right now. Thank you for being here today, and we'll be going through with you what to expect for JC history. So we'll begin by introducing ourselves. Yes. So I'm Jody, and with me today I have Clarice. We both took IP history, and for me in JC I took health, which is history, econs, literature, and math. And for Clarice, she took biology, chemistry, mathematics, and history. Currently, I'm in Yale NUS, and Clarice is in NUS College of Humanities and Sciences. So we will begin by sharing with you the H2 history syllabus. So the H2 syllabus is split into two papers. The first is international history, and the second is Southeast Asian history. Both papers are 3 hours each. For each paper, there'll be one source-based question with two parts. Part A is the comparison question. Part B is the evaluation question. And following that, you'll have two essays in total. So for the essays, you'll choose one out of two for each theme. So for instance, if let's say the question is on economic development, there'll be two questions under that, and you just have to pick one to do. So this is an example question for the SBQ. I believe most of you will be more familiar with the comparison, and comparison is quite straightforward. It's just finding one similarity and one difference between two sources. Whereas the evaluation question is probably something that most of us are not familiar with. At least for me, when I was moving from secondary 4 to JC, I was kind of confused about how the evaluation question worked, because you have to evaluate 6 sources and you have to group them into two different sets. One is the support set which will support the assertion, and the other is the challenge set that will challenge the assertion. Yeah. So moving on to paper one, international history. There are three themes for paper one. The first is the Cold War. The second is understanding the global economy. And the third is safeguarding international peace and security, which is essentially about the United Nations. For the Cold War is for the source-based question, while the global economy topic and the one on the UN would be for the essay. So understanding the Cold War. For me, at least in secondary school, my teacher went through the Cold War. So it wasn't a completely new topic for me, especially in terms of like the emergence of the Cold War, since I had already gone through Berlin blockade, Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan, and things like that. And this was the same for the end of the Cold War. The more challenging part for JC history, in my opinion, was the manifestations of the Cold War. It went beyond what I learned for Korean War, Cuban Missile Crisis, and Vietnam War. Suddenly, I had to learn about things happening in the Eastern Bloc, like the Prague Spring, as well as the arms race between the US and the USSR. And so, for the manifestations of the Cold War, I would say that it went beyond what was covered in IP history. So, there'll be new content that you'll learn under this theme. The second theme is understanding the global economy. And this theme was completely not covered under IP history for me and Clarice. And I would like to say first that you don't need to take econs to understand this topic. Some of my friends who didn't take econs in JC were still able to do the topic and understand the content, and they scored pretty well for their essays as well. So if you're not planning to take econs, don't be scared about this topic. You'll be completely fine. Yeah. And like I said, this was not covered in IP history, and there are two aspects to this. The first is the growth and problems in the global economy. So for this aspect, you'll learn more about like how after the end of World War II, there were new institutions which emerged, like the World Bank and things like that. And then you also learn about the challenges like the oil crisis and blah blah blah. I think if you are interested in current affairs, this topic will be quite interesting to you because you get to see how um like trade across the years has evolved. And the second part to the theme is the rise of the Asian tiger economies, mainly South Korea and Taiwan. And lastly, the third theme is safeguarding international peace and security, which is essentially just about the United Nations. So there are three parts to this. The first is the formation of the United Nations, and then followed by the political effectiveness of the United Nations, and lastly, the reforms implemented by the UN and what are some reforms that they were planning to implement but perhaps didn't. And I guess like the economic history topic, this will be of interest to those who like current affairs a lot. And especially since like right now the UN is still very active and all that. And I guess Yeah, for me at least, I really like the learning about peacekeeping efforts because it was interesting to see how the UN implemented different different policies and how they met different challenges over the years and how they evolved to improve. But at the same time, there are still problems which continue to plague the UN despite their reforms. I will then pass the time on to Clarice, who will briefly go through with you what will be covered under paper two.
Hi, so under paper two, there are also three themes. So the first theme would be like the search for political stability, which kind of goes through like the different types of governments that Southeast Asian states like undertook after independence. And theme two would be economic development in the region. And theme three would be regional conflicts and cooperation, where you get to learn a bit more about like the diplomatic ties between countries in Southeast Asia. So paper two is like supposed to be completely new lah because it's about Southeast Asian history. But it's also my favorite paper. So yeah. So moving on to theme one, we have approaches to governance, which under that we have like emergence of rural political structures, which in a very simple sense just kind of means like a type of democracy. And then we go through like the fall of such plural political structures, and then the rise of like maximum governments, which are basically like a type of authoritarian government. And you don't really have to like be very scared about all of like the terminology that I'm saying right now, because like if you once you like get to like actually learning about the topic, it should get like quite easy for you to understand. The second part would be like approaches to national unity in the region. So you get to explore like states that undertook multicultural vs like dominant culture policies in the region, and like also like what type of policies they had towards like minorities. And personally, this is my one of my favorite topics in H2 history, but at the same time, it's also quite a difficult topic because when it comes to national unity, it's very intangible and it becomes like a bit hard to argue for when you're arguing about something like as intangible as like unity in a country. But it's also very fun, so great. Then we have theme two, which is economic development. So under this theme, you'll kind of learn about like the different policies that Southeast Asian states took to kind of develop their economy. So you learn about like the economic challenges they faced, and like different economic policies states undertook to address challenges. Then you have the Asian financial crisis of 1997, where you kind of we learn about the causes, consequences, and responses to the crisis, and basically how the crisis kind of hit the entire region. Okay, so now we have theme three. So basically, this theme is the theme for source space. So the previous two themes were the essay topics. So the regional conflicts and cooperation will be tested for source based question. So under here, we have interstate tensions and cooperation. So you will learn about different territorial disputes and bilateral relations between like countries. So basically, you have to learn about basically like every permutation of like diplomatic relations. Like you learn about Singapore, Malaysia, you learn about Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, all of that. And I think this is quite interesting because even up till now, there are some disputes that kind of still persist until like current day. Like you have the Pedro Branca dispute between Singapore and Malaysia. So it's quite fun to learn about all of that. And next, we also have ASEAN. So you get to learn about like the formation of ASEAN, why ASEAN was formed, and basically learn about how its role in the region kind of developed. Because I think it started out as like a anti-communist kind of organization, but I think it slowly moved into a regional organization that like focused more about bringing peace to the region and also encouraging economic cooperation. You also get to learn about like some disputes like South China Sea and Cambodian crisis and how ASEAN dealt with such crises. Okay, so I'll move on to like the differences between JC and IP history. So basically, there are new topics like such as the United Nations and Asian financial crisis, and actually basically the entirety of paper two. But I think it's quite fun, so it's fine still. But then you also have heavier content. So as Judy mentioned just now, uh, even under paper one, even though you learn about like the core and stuff, you have to learn a lot more in depth, and you need to like know a lot more content. Uh like what she mentioned just now, you have to learn about like the Prague Spring, Middle East, that kind of thing. And I think in comparison to like IP history or like secondary school history, you cannot just name drop events, especially in source based questions. You kind of have to like understand the case study that you're trying to bring in. And if you just name drop, then like the marker won't give you like that much credit for it. And most importantly, there are different types of essays in JC history. So there are comparative essays in paper two, where it becomes a lot more important for you to observe trends across the entire Southeast Asian region. And it's not like so much about like simply memorizing like something, this specific event that happened in this specific country. You have to learn about like the general trends throughout the region. So like maybe like take for example like the topic on economic development, you have to know which states like took which policies, like for example import substitution industrialization vs export oriented industrialization. And then you have to know how these policies led to differing outcomes in their uh, economic growth. So contrasting case studies are very important, especially for paper two, and it becomes like quite important because you have an extra level of like historical concepts you have to show in JC history. So I think in secondary school we're kind of used to just going through causation, but other than that, I think there's also change and continuity and diversity that you really have to show that you understand and you can apply it to the topics, the essays that you are writing. Yeah. Now I'll pass back the time to Jody.
Okay, so we'll be sharing with you about why we chose history or why you should also choose history. So I think firstly, history equips you with critical thinking skills and content knowledge that you can apply to other subjects. I think for the content knowledge part, it will be quite useful for GP especially because sometimes there might be questions related to history or related to, for example, political organizations. And because if you learn about the United Nations and ASEAN, then these case studies may be helpful for you when you are writing your essay. But beyond that, for me at least, I took history economics in JC2, and I found that taking H2 history helped me to understand the content I learned in history economics a lot better because I could finally see how the theory I learned was being applied in real life. Yeah. And also the second point is you can learn about the context behind current global affairs. So like for example, what Clarice said about actually no, like okay, so for example, like what Clarice said about ASEAN, right? So even till today, things like the South China Sea issue continues to be a problem. And by taking history, you get to understand the nuances behind these problems, and you get to understand more about why these problems continue to be a problem, and why they haven't been solved, even though so much time and effort has been put into it trying to solve these issues. Yes, and also if you plan to do political science or international relations, and also if you plan to do history in the future at the university level, I think taking history may be useful for you because it helps you to understand the context for a lot of global events. And also the reason, I guess, but at the end of the day, the main reason why the two of us chose history was because we had a genuine interest in the subject. For me, I liked history a lot because there seemed to be this sort of storyline to it, and it wasn't just me dealing with numbers and equations. And that was the main reason why I took history. And if that is something that you enjoy as well, then I think maybe you might want to consider taking history. Also, I want to say that if you did not take history in secondary school, do not be afraid. I had friends who didn't take history as well, but they were able to do very well at A levels also. It's more, especially, I think this is the reason behind this is that not a lot of content from secondary school history is being transferred to the JC syllabus. So you are not exactly at a disadvantage if you didn't take history in secondary school. Okay, but of course there will be some challenges when it comes to taking history. And the first one is that H2 history is not as straightforward as secondary school history. In my experience, when I took history in secondary school, I could just memorize facts and case studies and then just blurt them all out in my essay. But for JC, it's not that simple. You actually have to digest the content you study so that you can make good use of it. So, for example, when you are looking at source-based questions, right, and you are doing the Code War, there are a lot of events that are happening, and you cannot just memorize the event, then just like dump the event into your essay and just treat it as like, oh, this will show that this source is reliable, blah blah blah. You actually need to understand how the different events affect each other and how like different factors interplay with each other. And I feel like that's not something that was focused on in secondary school. And like the second point is what Clarice has already mentioned, which is that H2 history requires you to make use of different historical concepts and not just causation. And that might be difficult to get used at the start. And in addition, we realize that source-based questions can be more ambiguous and it can be more challenging at the JC level because at the JC level, the Cambridge isn't really testing you on your content knowledge only. They are also trying to test you on your skills. So there have been cases where they tested events like the Pedra Branca incident, which most schools did not really cover in depth during the school year. So during the A level paper, a lot of people were kind of shocked by that. But if you have a good foundation in terms of making use of skills, the historical skills needed to tackle source-based questions, then this is also not a problem. But it is something that you might want to consider. Yeah. And in terms of grading, from our experience, it's quite easy to get a B, but it can be a bit difficult to move up to an A in internal exams. But ultimately, at the A levels, most people around us were able to get an A. Yeah. Is there history? Yeah, there is history. There are two types, I think. The first one is under the research program, which you cover where you are like attached to this mentor at a university and then you do a paper. The other one is you just do it within school and you have a teacher mentor. Yeah, but I didn't take history, but my friends had fun doing history though. Yeah. Is here history a prerequisite? No, history is not a prerequisite for anything. I think for most of the social sciences, for the arts and social sciences at least, there are usually no prerequisites. From what I understand, for only econs has a prerequisite, I think, and it's H1 math. Yeah. But beyond that, no, there's no prerequisite. It's just that knowing history will be helpful. Is H2 history harder than H2 geography? I did not take geography, so I cannot really answer this question. Yeah, but I'll say that the two subjects, in terms of content at least, is very, very different. Yeah. If you have questions on H2 geography, you can maybe go to the Inkie Learning Discord group and ask about it because I'm not too sure about what they cover and what are the skills needed and how their paper is structured. If one doesn't take history in secondary 3 and secondary 4, how much harder will one have to mark to catch up in JC1? I would say you won't have to mark harder than the other people actually because the only sort of advantage I had was that I knew some things about the Cold War, but beyond that, things like economic development, ASEAN, all these topics were not covered in secondary 3 and secondary 4. So content knowledge wise, there was not really any advantage for me. In terms of essay writing, I would say that I don't think there was any advantage either. Yeah. And then SVQ skills, I think, wait, Clarice, SVQ skills.
SVQ for maybe for part A, you'll just be like a bit more familiar with it. But like honestly, for part B in JC, it's quite different. I would say. I don't know. Like it was just much harder for me in JC to answer the SVQ part B. So I felt like even though I took it in Sec 3 and 4, it didn't really help me that much because the answering techniques are kind of quite different.
Yeah, and for the evaluation question for SVQ, right? I think my history teacher in secondary school went through a bit of it, but it was a super watered down version. It wasn't really as in-depth as the one in JC. Like in JC, I suddenly had to analyze every single source, analyze all 6 sources, group every single source, explain why this source belongs in this set, and also try to substantiate on why the source is reliable. But in secondary school, it was like not that intense. It just maybe the teacher give me 3 sources to evaluate and then I'm done. Yeah, so actually I don't think you'll be at disadvantage and you don't need to mark a lot harder than the other people. You probably mark at the same rate as them for history. Good at writing essays. Complete the subject of tips. Okay, so I think the one study tip I have for essay writing is that you cannot study the same way as you did in secondary school. Because in secondary school, the way I studied history was very case study oriented in the sense that I just like study the whole causation and stuff. And then when I write my essay, I just repeat everything in the essay. But in JC, when you are studying, right, you suddenly have to be more strategic about it because there are a lot of other subjects that you need to focus on as well. And for for paper 2 especially with the comparison question, you have to it'll be easier to have a broad, how to say, like a big point and then include case studies for every big point so that it's easier for you to organize your ideas and thoughts when you're writing your essay. So one example would be that in Southeast Asia, a lot of countries, I don't know, you make use of violence or something to in to maintain political stability or something like that. Then if that's your main point, then you have to find 2 case studies under that point, and then that will make studying a lot easier for you rather than consolidating your all your knowledge by country. Yeah, I think it's mainly that. SBQ is just like, yeah.
I think for SVQs, I would say, like, for study tips, I would say just create like a timeline of important events. Then you just study that timeline and with like a very concise like summary of each event. Then honestly, to me, that was the best way to study for source space because there's just too many events in like there's too many things in history to study. So if you just like memorize like the key dates and like basically a vague like summary of like what each event is, it will help you a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Is time a large concern during exams? For me, it was okay. I think I wrote quite quickly, so it was fine for me. But I do know of people who had difficulties finishing their essays since there are like 4 things for you to complete. But I would say that it shouldn't be a large concern though, because most people manage to finish their papers on time. I think this is especially the case if you are already familiar with the content and you need less time to plan your essays and to analyze the sources if you're familiar with the content. So if you are familiar, you'll be fine. Yes. Is history useful when pursuing law in uni? Uh, I'm not doing law, so I can't really say much about it. But I guess maybe since history is a very essay-based subject, maybe that aspect of history will be useful when you are pursuing law, since you will have to like write a lot of essays when you're studying law as well. And I guess history might also be useful when it comes to the whole analysis portion, since you have to analyze different types of sources, and it might help you if you take law. Yeah. Choosing between economics and history, do you have any advice? Okay, so I faced this dilemma in J1 also because at first I wasn't supposed to be taking econs, but I took econs in the end. But before that, I was also in this dilemma. So I think I think it depends on what you want because history and econs are quite different at the JC level in my opinion, especially in terms of content. Because history is very, for me, history was way more interesting. Econs was a lot of like theory and yeah, it's just mainly theory, applying theory to your different essays. Whereas history was more of a it was more like interesting for me because there seemed to be more interesting content in terms of like analyzing different um international organizations, etc. Whereas econs is really just like demand, supply, and then you draw the curve. Yeah, so it depends on what you want, but I would say that both are okay. Both are fine. And, but personally, I prefer history just cause it's more interesting. If you are interested in, if you have a dilemma between these two topics, you might also want to take a look at the econ syllabus to see if that is what you are interested in. Yeah. But also history covers a bit of econs, I guess, since that's the economic history part, which was kind of why at that point I prioritized taking history over econs, since I thought that by taking history I would kind of be learning a bit about econs as well. Just that it's economic history and not really the economic theory part of econs. Yeah. How many books do you have to study for history? There are no books at JC for JC history. It's just lecture notes given to us by our teachers. So, Clarice, do you want to take this question?
So yeah, there's no books like textbooks in that you are used to in secondary school. It's kind of just your teachers or like your history department from your school kind of creates lecture notes and you study those lecture notes. So like as you mentioned just now, there's like the 3 themes per paper. So they'll just create like lecture notes for each like subtopic under each theme and each sub theme, and then you just have to study that. There's no I'm not too sure, but like for us it was very our lecture notes were very long. Um, but yeah, the books wise, yeah, we didn't really have books, so not not too applicable to JC history.
Yeah, and I think to add on, I'll say that the length of your lecture notes will depend on your teacher, because Clarice and I had different teachers, and my teacher's notes were way longer than hers for some reason. Like her teacher just picked out the more key points for them to study, whereas my teacher really just like put every single detail inside and then told us to read everything and pick out the details for ourselves. So I'll say that this will differ from teacher to teacher and from school to school as well. Yeah. Between H2 history and H2 biology, which subject is more content heavy?
Okay, honestly, I think for me personally, I felt that H2 bio was like more content heavy. But I think it's also a personal thing because to me, I felt that history was a lot more like a storyline, and I didn't really have to like memorize like the case studies word for word, if you get what I mean. Because like if you just write it out, write like what you know in like very layman's term way, they would the your history marker, history teacher will still like be likely to accept it. But for H2 bio, you kind of have to know all the keywords and everything. And if you like forget one part, it kind of you won't get the mark lah, basically, because the teachers for H2 bio will mark based on like keywords and everything. So to me, I found that H2 bio was more content heavy because I had to know like every specific term instead of like just knowing like the brief summary of it. But I think it could vary from person to person as well, because I know a lot of people that took bio also felt that bio was like a story to them. But yeah, personally, I would feel that history would be was more manageable for me lah, and I didn't have to spend as much time memorizing history as compared to bio. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Is history lots of memory work? I would say yes, to a certain extent, it is quite a lot of memory work because you have to memorize all the different case studies and memorize all the different dates. But I think if you, for me at least, because I did practices for my essays and my source-based questions. So a lot of times the key dates that you use will be the same. So at the end of the day, you realize that it's not that much memory work involved. At some point, you'll just be familiar with the content, and then you don't really need to spend as much time memorizing, especially for source-based question. But then for essay, I'll say that it is quite a lot of memory work because you have to memorize the details of the different case studies. Yeah. Paris, memorizing for you, was it okay?
I think it was okay for me as well because I don't know when if you do like kind of consistent practice, it kind of the history content kind of stays in your brain, I guess. And it's a bit easier to recall everything when it comes to the exam if you do consistent practice lah. So as I mentioned earlier, history is like you can just remember like a summary of like each event and then like write it out again. So to me it was like writing a story. So I think it didn't take me as much effort to memorize like all of the stuff. But maybe for like specific dates or specific events, it would be a bit difficult. But other than that, I think it's fine.
Okay, to add on to what Clarice has said, right? I think the difficult part for memorization for history is the topics under economic development, because for those topics you have statistics to remember. I think that was the tougher part when it came to memory work.
Yeah.
But if you're talking about the other themes like maximum government, United Nations, I think those themes were relatively easier to memorize because there weren't as many figures for you to remember. Yeah.